been accurately said that robots don't sleep. My guest today is living proof. Robot Koch is a superhuman musician, composer, and producer. Robot has released 8 studio albums since 2009. He's produced and written 12 albums for other artists. He's written music for television shows such as The Vampire Diaries, Beauty and the Beast, on Netflix, The Lucifer Show, You, and Dark. He has made incredible contributions to the music industry, and he is my guest today. Robot, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Big pleasure.
Well, you've obviously made quite a name for yourself since you first emerged on the ambient music scene. You've been awarded several gold and platinum records. You've won German Music Composer Awards in 2019 for the Best Composer of Electronic Music. You've been on several major tours at major music festivals. You've run your own record label called Trees and Cyborgs. So my first question to you is pretty obvious. When do you actually sleep?
That's a great question. Well, the name Robots Don't Sleep comes from a time where I was actually diagnosed with insomnia.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear it.
This is it's about 2009 when it was really bad. That's when the first record came out, my first album. It was mainly due to a lot of touring at the time. I was in a band prior to my solo efforts, and we used to tour intensively, and that whole nightlife and flying around the globe kind of schedule didn't work with me personally. It worked well with my bandmates, and that made me realize this kind of life is not for everyone, But I was in a weird conundrum because I was doing the thing that I loved, which is music.
Right.
Yet I was depressed and sleep deprived. And I was like, what am I doing wrong? This is the dream that I'm living, but I'm not enjoying it. So then I realized that, I could reimagine how this works for me. And I always enjoyed creating music more than I did enjoy performing music. I like performing music, but it felt a little secondary to me. And it took a lot of time and energy away from being in the studio and actually being, the mad scientist that comes up with something new, which is, the passion that I have, just like starting with a blank canvas and coming out of coming up with something that didn't exist prior to that, that's what I enjoyed. So I kind of pivoted from being a performing touring musician more and more to being a writer, composer, producer person that just releases a lot of music. The less I toured, the more music I could create and release. So yeah, it's all a balance.
I understand completely. I did that lifestyle for a time in my younger years and my early 20s and was just a weekend warrior. We call them here in the States, playing on the weekends only. But it is not a lifestyle conducive to any kind of balance that I could ever find. And there is that dichotomy that you have to deal with because you absolutely love what it is you do. But simultaneously, there is, gosh, how long can this go on, right?
Exactly.
So I think you made the wise choice, my friend, because otherwise you probably have burnt out like I had done several times. Very, very good move on your part. But it's an impressive body of work that you've come up with over the relatively short period of time. You first released your album in 2009, so we're talking about, just under 15 years, right?
Yeah, something like this. I'm terrible at math, so don't ask me.
I understand. That's why I had to think about it myself. My second question to you is, because of the type of music that you create, have you ever composed in your sleep? There's this wonderful story, for instance, about Paul McCartney waking up with the melody for Yesterday. And I've had that experience. Have you ever had that experience of waking up with that melody in your head?
Absolutely. It doesn't happen as often as I wish it would, but I was able to catch a few of those dream melodies or they're almost like scenarios, it's like a whole scenario where it's like a visual, it's almost like I'm watching a movie and then there's a song playing,
right? Almost
Almost like a score to that scene, and I'm almost like watching it like I'm watching a movie, and I'm just so in awe by the beauty of what I'm hearing, and I'm just almost conscious in the dream of like wanting to remember it. And then oftentimes I wake up and I can't quite put it together, but I have been able to successfully put down a few ideas that I sort of rescued from my sleep state into the waking state.
Right. I've always been fascinated by that concept. What are your thoughts about that? Where do you think these ideas come from? Think they come from a subconscious place within you, or do you think you're accessing something larger?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think in general, music for me, and maybe for everyone who makes music, I think we're just a conduit. It's just ideally we're a channel for it to come through. So I don't sometimes even think of my music as my music like that. I was just like fortunate enough to receive it, so to speak. Or maybe I did my part in being a clear enough channel and sort of removing myself, getting out of the way for the idea to come through. Which also takes a lot of work. Because the ego is what needs to be moved out of the way oftentimes. And it has to do with intention too. There's this quote, I think it's Quincy Jones, who said, "If you're thinking about money while you're making music, God walks out of the room."
Brilliant
so
quote.
that's
Right.
Yeah, I agree. It's also true in the sense of oftentimes it's not the meal but the ingredients and the kind of intention you put into cooking it. And the same with a letter. You write a letter, it's not the exact words you choose, it's the intention which you put behind what you're writing. I think the intention being a very subtle frequency. I think we're getting very quickly into a topic here that I'm very interested in, which is frequency and vibrational energy in general. But I think that, and in a way, these ideas come from somewhere larger than our limited perspective, just to wrap it in a short sentence.
No, absolutely agree. And we will be going down this rabbit hole. I think it's an important part of the conversation and rarely covered, and yet simultaneously, because if you listen to previous episodes of this podcast, with all the research that's been going on, what we're talking about here is frequency and vibration and consciousness and the way that they're interwoven in some mysterious way that we're trying to unwrap as a bunch of researchers and explorers. But I'm very curious to know, and we will be going down that rabbit hole, when did you first start composing music?
Yeah, the first time I was aware of sound was at a very young age. I was sitting at the piano of my mom, and I was just pressing down a single note.
Right.
And I had the sustain pedal pressed, so I could hear the sound of the piano, of that single note, reverberate in the body of the piano and in the room. And I was just fascinated by the decay and how it rang out. And that was just like an experience that I remember vividly, because I found it very pleasant to just listen to the reverb and the decay of the sound and how it became more faint and faint as it rang out. But there wasn't composition, of course. This was just like enjoying sound as such, musical instrument sound. And then I grew up in a house where my dad wasn't very musical at all. I mean, he was into Frank Sinatra, but it was something that was running in the background at a low volume, And my mom was into Motown, Four Tops, Stevie Wonder, that kind of stuff. And that was the kind of environment I grew up in. And I think I wasn't a good piano student, although I had piano lessons at an early age. I was a terrible student, actually. My mom told my teacher told my mom to not waste her money on me because I just didn't rehearse. I was just like not going anywhere. However, we had MTV. This was in the early 90s, I think. You have to imagine West Germany, pre-internet. MTV was about as far as it got in terms of having a window to the world.
Right.
And I remember watching, it was either 120 Minutes, which was like an indie alternative show, or one of these programs. And I saw a video of this band, Faith No More, which were big in the 90s. And I remember it as an audio-visual experience, because it wasn't so much the song itself. It was like what I saw, especially the drummer, with like long dreadlocks, and was really working the kit, and everything felt very intense.
Right.
And I'm very fascinated by the intensity of that, because all the Motown stuff that I listened to was always, very pleasing and upbeat and happy. And that was kind of, it was aggressive, but it wasn't aggressive to me. It was just intense. And I was interested in the intensity. So I asked my mom if I could get drum lessons, and she was terrified, of course. But this was actually the instrument that I first started on, and started on being passionate about, And I guess that's where I started making music in bands at that time, around 14, 15. And I progressed quickly from being a drummer to, being a DJ a little later. I got into crate digging and, wanting to understand where all these samples came from that were used in like early 90s hip hop.
Right.
So I got into jazz through that. From jazz, I got into playing jazz on the drums. From that, I became more interested in programming beats on the computer with like early samplers and stuff. And that was the progression, starting out as a drummer and then working my way into being a beat maker, and from a beat maker to a producer, and from a producer to a composer, I guess.
Well, your story sounds an awful lot like mine. I started off on the drums. It was a fascination, a love of the sounds that I heard that first struck me. I knew from the bottom of my heart at a very young age, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And if you look in my studio, you can see, obviously, that is true, right? But I'm very curious about the way that you compose music. Your music has been described as a dialogue between technology and nature. And a fellow at the BBC, I don't know if he was a critic or a DJ, but he noted that your music, he said, quote unquote, sounds like artificial intelligence discovering religion. After listening to your music, I agree completely. Both descriptions are very apt, in my opinion. The artificial intelligence discovering religion and this dialogue between technology and nature. You go by the name Robot Koch. That's your professional name. Your given name is obviously Robert. Are you trying to make a statement about the way that tech and humanity are coming to an interface point in our evolution? Is that what you're reaching for?
Yeah, it's a subconscious statement. I was very much drawn towards science fiction as an early child. Any kind of fantasy or, like surreal storytelling, like anything that wasn't rooted in like left brain logic reality.
Right.
Although I was very conditioned to be left brain, growing up in Germany, school, it's always about the right answer and all these things. However, my passion and my heart was always where the unknown and the sort of mysterious lies, So I was drawn towards these kind of films and these kind of stories. And at the same time, I was a lover of nature since an early age because we grew up next to a forest and I was just like out in the forest more than I was to be found anywhere else in the house.
Understood. Volksmarch.
It was just like that seemingly paradoxical or opposed poles that pulled me in two directions: the fascination for the otherworldly and the science fiction technology driven side, and then the natural back to the roots kind of grounded reality, and I think exactly between these two poles is where my music oscillates,
Right.
between these two seemingly opposite poles.
So you find balance within yourself as you create this between those two poles. I had quite a lot of producing of new age music, ambient music, meditation music for the Monroe Institute in the 80s and 90s. That was one of my functions there. So I know the genre pretty well. And I think you've done a pretty masterful job of exemplifying the hybrid of acoustic instruments and then morphing them into obviously synthesized sounds. I was thinking about one of the tracks from your latest release. It was called The Next Billion Years. It's also labeled Foam and Sand. And the track that I'm referring to here is called Post-String Theory. It's just gorgeous. You did a masterful job with that. All of your music. You're quite welcome and deserving. What are your feelings about humanity and tech becoming a hybrid, which seems to be happening? It seems almost inevitable. Are you a fan of this idea?
Yeah, it seems inevitable, but at the same time, I think we're at the crossroads where we as a species decide where we want to go. Do we want to eventually just fuse with technology and also outsource all the problem solving to technology? Or are we basically going the other way, which is a little more back to the roots, back to nature, also simplifying? I think there's these two ways that we're looking at, and I think there's a choice really, because I think personally the idea of constant growth is wrong. We're just like been led to believe that we can just constantly accumulate more and like consume more or whatever. It's just like more in general. And I think we need to downsize again and simplify, and that might mean that we need to let go of opportunities that we have around technology, or we could let technology assist us. But the main concern that I have is that there's an outward reach. So we're looking outside of ourselves for the solution of problems, which is technology, which is outside of ourselves.
Right.
And then I think personally, and this is also parallel to my personal story, all the answers lie within, and it's more of an internal exploration rather than external exploration. So rather than wanting to go to Mars and wanting to fuse with technology, I think we are soft technology ourselves that we haven't even fully explored, and I think there lies great potential, especially in the conversation around consciousness, that we should be careful not to just outsource and externalize all the hopes and dreams about the future,
I wonder if we're not getting a little lazy, or that perhaps we haven't been inspired enough to explore the outermost reaches of the inner self in the same way that we've been encouraged to explore, say, space. And I know that you did a rather intriguing project in various planetariums throughout the world, where you composed music and performed it in 3D immersive with surround sound, which you produced with a visual artist by the name of Michael Lagouf. Do I have his name right? Okay.
That's correct. French friend of mine.
Right, and this also won an award for Best Immersive Experience. I can imagine it was a beautiful show. It was a great idea, and I'm sure it was very powerful for the audience. Did you have a fascination with the expanse of space and time, and what does it represent for you?
It's the ultimate frontier, and it's also the uncomfortable place that we all feel around not knowing, which ultimately fascinates me. And I have this almost like a dispute with my mom, who's always offended with anything that's otherworldly and out there, because she's like, why spend your time with something that's not real? That's like such a waste of time.
Right.
And then I would say, like, how do you know it's not real? Just because science hasn't proven something yet doesn't mean it's not real. At some point, gravity was working on this planet long before, there was like a mathematic law formulated around it.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a lot of things present today that our scientific left brain mind can't grasp yet they're still real, and I think that's my fascination, the unknown. There's also a lot of fear around the unknown. People tend to fear, or like humans tend to fear what they don't know, and there's probably good reasons for that. Evolutionary, not wanting to go into the dark cave without knowing there's a bear in there or whatever it is. There's instincts that keep us a little at bay from the depths, be it the depths of space or the ocean or the dark cave. But I personally believe that the biggest gifts in terms of evolution lie in those dark caves and in those dark oceans and out of spaces. So it draws me in there, and I sort of make that a theme in my work. There's always like a dark undercurrent. It's not necessarily dark because I want my music to be pleasing and like a warm embrace at the same time, but I want it to feel otherworldly and familiar at the same time. So it takes you by the hand and gives you a little bit of trust while walking you into the cave.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the typical hero's journey. You hear the call, it's appealing, your music is a call, but you're taking them to that, I'm looking for the word, I think they call it the apotheosis in the hero's journey, where you look into the belly of the beast. You look at the darkness and find, as Nietzsche pointed out, that it's going to look back at you. And that reflection is something that is part of the important, or I should say an important part of our evolution, not only as individuals, but as a species. I think it's very important. And meditation is obviously a way to get in there. You recently worked with my friend Bob Holbrook, who is the current recording engineer at the Monroe Institute. You created a meditation version of a title called Circle 37 from your record Foam and Sand, which you recorded with Priscilla Ahn. Beautiful work. Allow me to play just a moment of it for the audience. Some beautiful work there. I have to say what you and Priscilla did had gravitas on its own, and Bob seamlessly interweaved binaural beat complexes to great effect there. How did that relationship between yourself and Monroe Institute come about? Obviously, you're interested in consciousness exploration and meditation, but how did you end up working with the Monroe Institute?
Yeah, that's a funny story because I sort of put it out to the universe, so to speak, as an intention to connect with people that I didn't know at the time that would allow me to present my music in a different scenario. And what I mean by that is let people experience the music on a deeper level. And I didn't know what that meant. Sometimes I'm a little vague about my intentions as well because I sort of let the bigger whole work out the details.
Right.
But there was this intention, and it was out there for a while. And then I was at a event in Los Angeles, which is called Listen to Music Under a Tree in the Daylight. Mm-hmm. And it's by Leaving Records, a Los Angeles-based label who put on these shows, which are basically picnic blankets and a variety of all genre music. Very beautiful. So I was at one of these events, and on the picnic blanket next to me, somebody sat down, and it was Robert Neville, who I later found out works for Monroe Institute.
Right.
Briefly chatted, and he asked me, "What do you do?" And I was like, "I make music." "What kind of music?" I was like, "Atmospheric, ambient music." And he was like, "Oh, we're gonna talk," Mm-hmm. And then, like half a year later, we exchanged numbers. I forgot about it. He called me and he explained to me that he had a very profound experience around one of my records that he found on Spotify through the algorithm. It presented it to him, and he went back to his computer wanting to know, what is that? It really spoke to him. And then what he did, he put on one of your podcasts, I think it was Apple. And then at the same time, he was running Spotify with the music. So he found that balance between these two audio signals.
Right.
And was able to enjoy what was being shared in the podcast in an even deeper way than he has previously been able to. So I realized that was a beautiful story, and it just led me to believe, music is a carrier medium to bring in something that in itself, what was being shared on the podcast was already powerful. And the music in itself, without wanting to say that my music is powerful, but I can state that music in itself is powerful. Combining these two signals just made for an experience that Robert described as profound. So this was the beginning, essentially. And then we talked about, where do we go from here? What can we explore?
Well, your music is powerful. We can be part of the Mutual Admiration Society, you and I. Thank you for your kind words about the podcast. I'm actually feeling very blessed to just be in this position to be able to talk to folks about my favorite subject, which is consciousness. And I feel like I speak with brilliant people on the subject all the time. So I'm interested in the way that you use consciousness to record and create your music. Obviously, you're inspired by meditation. You take people on journeys. What kind of journeys do you use in order to inspire yourself? I'm going to guess that you're a practiced meditator. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I've been practicing meditation I think for about 7 years now. Mm-hmm. I have not missed a sitting in all that time. So I meditate twice daily. So I'm a very dedicated meditator, you could say. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I find meditation also being a formal practice that I can expand into something which is just like mindfulness and awareness in my day-to-day endeavors, And when you ask about inspiration and the fuel where this comes from, I would say nature and silence are like the biggest components. The more I detach from external impulses and stimuli, the more I can allow something to emerge from wherever that is. Right. And it takes silence, it takes meditation, and it takes being surrounded by nature. For me, that's kind of what does it for me. And sometimes it's even like a retreat. I would go to a Joshua Tree, rent a cabin, just be in the silence and look at the night sky for 2 or 3 days, and even not work on music while I'm out there. But then I come back to my studio in LA, and something comes pouring out of me that I needed to allow myself that space for it to come through. So that's something I do.
So it's the quiet and the spaciousness of meditation. The style of meditation that you use is what you try to quiet your mind?
Well, formally it's transcendental meditation. That's what I learned, quote unquote. But I've not been like super dedicated to just this mantra-based meditation because that's what it is.
Right.
I also tried different types of meditation, even just like observing the chatter in the mind and not getting attached to it, just witnessing it. Even not trying to quiet it. There's been different styles that I experiment with. Essentially, paying attention to the body is something that really gets me there. It could be the breath. It could just be the uncomfortability I experience in the present moment and just like being with that. And then the same is true when I make music. Oftentimes I have a piece of music that I work on, oftentimes on headphones, because I enjoy the cocoon type space that I create for myself.
Right.
And then I close my eyes and listen back to what I'm just working on and pay attention to how that feels in my body. Like literally, like, does it relax me? Does it agitate me? What's my nervous system response to this? What I'm hearing? And I pay attention to that. And that kind of guides me where to go, because I might notice some element in the music that distracts me or that just takes me out of just being in a down-regulated nervous system response, so to speak, which sometimes I want to be in when I create or listen to music. And so I can very easily identify, it's almost like a bird's eye view. Once I'm in that zone with closed eyes, I can identify which elements are conducive to the experience, which ones are maybe a little distracting. And then I can go back into the focused mindset and just like eliminate what needs to be taken out or amplify whatever needs to be, taken into the center stage of the attention, so to speak.
I understand. So most musicians that I know are very auditorily based. They hear things. That's their primary sense perception. What I'm hearing with you, with your early experience with the one note on the piano and being taken by the reverberation and the sustain, is it had an effect vibrationally that you could palpably sense with your kinesthetic sense. Is that accurate to say? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, absolutely. And thank you for that observation. I think you totally nailed it with that one. It's definitely something that I'm only learning to pay attention to, even though I described the childhood memory where that was already true and present for me. I don't think I was conscious of that until rather recently, because it's a process, and both like conscious exploration and insight, looking inside, like know thyself, so to speak, being a process. And then there's the creative process, and they go hand in hand for me. And I think I've been doing a lot of things musically subconsciously, which I've not been aware of logically yet. And now I'm sort of trying to catch up, that I'm realizing, oh, this is what I've been doing all along. This is how it worked for me, and the more I become conscious of that, the better I can employ that and be like, this is actually a technique that works for me. So what I just described to you about paying attention to my body, this was true to me age 6 when I pressed that note on the piano, but I wasn't aware of it. Now I'm aware of it. So now I'm consciously sitting down, paying attention to how something reverberates and vibrates in my body, how it resonates. And now I can make use of it even more intentionally.
Yeah, I understand that completely. And when we come back from this quick break, I want to talk more about that. We'll be back with Robot Koch in just a moment.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
So we're talking about the subconscious, the personal subconscious reaction that you have to your music and what you think you're tapping into. I also get the impression that you're tapping into something a little bit larger, more of a collective kind of consciousness, which makes it probably more appealing. The other day I was doing my research for this interview and I had your music on. My wife comes into the studio and she's totally absorbed in it and said, "Who is that? What is that? I love that." I mean, you nailed it. You're able to tap into something larger when you can tap into yourself from a subconscious level. That's my expression and understanding of the purpose of meditation. You have to go through that subconscious dark night of the soul, so to speak, of self-understanding in order to reach the collective. Otherwise, you're going to sit there in your head only. So the fact that, I mean, everybody feels music in their body. That's why music is so appealing, right? It takes people on a physical journey. For me, it was always a transcendent experience of listening. It took me outside of myself when I first and I really connected with that. And I became fascinated with that at an early age. Now, I grew up in New York City, and the rhythm of New York City informed the things that would be created outside of just the rhythmic pattern. So the being in the subway train, for instance, you got right? And I'm sitting there, I'm counting that, I'm feeling that, right? That informs the bass line. And I'm moving, and I've got more instruments coming in. I mean, this was just a creative exercise for me, in composition. And all this is happening in my head, by the way. One day, it occurred to me to ask, where were all these ideas coming from? Are they reactive responses to a stimulus, which could be, right, the sound of the train, or the sound of nothing? What would that stimulus be like? So I was meditating very early on, right? And I started at about 17. I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the quiet. Not just trying to be quiet, but paying attention to what was occurring before the thoughts emerged. For instance, most people, when they get involved in meditation, they start off thinking about their thinking, okay? I seem to be thinking about this, and they create a little space, and, they learn how to deal with that. I was starting to pay attention to the space behind the thought. Where were these thoughts coming from? All the musical thoughts, because music was always running in my head. Do you have that same experience? Music always running in your head?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And also, it's a great question. Where do these things come from? And I think that's something that I try to not understand, but experience in meditation, the awareness prior to thought. It's almost, the thought is one thing, so it's an energy. But what is this awareness that perceives that thought, So you don't get identified with it. It's not like your thought. It's just like an energetic expression that might not even be informed by anything that has anything to do with you, because there's all this conditioning and society, and the narratives we subscribe to and all that stuff. So that thought might have just been a product of that whole energetic realm, which just manifested through you because you've been in resonance with it or in contact with it. So that makes you think, how original is your thought anyway, to begin with? And then that makes you think, what is that awareness that is perceiving the thought? What is prior to thought, And it's something you can't solve with your mind. And that's kind of what's beautiful about it. And that's what I love about music. It's beyond words. Words can only sort of point at something. It's like the proverbial finger pointing to the moon rather than the moon itself. It just basically tries to encapsulate something. But there's this Sufi poet who I really like, Hazrat Inayat Khan.
Me too.
He says, the moment, of course, I would think you would know him. The moment the truth is spoken, it's no longer the truth. It's one of his quotes.
Right.
And that makes a ton of sense to me. And also in the I Ching, it says, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao.
There you go.
And it shows again, it's like the limitation of words. They fall short to even describe or encompass what it is that we try to express. However, with music, which is coming from a wordless realm, it's something that we don't need to understand logically. We can dissect it with our mind. We can analyze it in terms of frequency or music theory. But somebody who has no idea whatsoever about any of that can perceive and enjoy and resonate with music. That's why I think it's such a powerful channel, really, like of communication. If you think about quantum physics and the idea of us, essentially not just being physical matter, but vibrational energy at the foundation, then it would make sense that we're also in contact with everything else that is also vibrational energy at its foundation. And then if everything is communicating with you and you're communicating with everything else, you're getting closer to where these ideas might be coming from.
And yet just the mere expression of that as a concept irradiates some truth and eradicates the concept of it being true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, we have to vaporize that as a concept in order to go further to find the truth. Exactly. I love where you're going with that. I'm also thinking about, I love writing lyrics. All right. Music and lyrics go hand in hand, right?
Of course.
Right.
That's true.
Are you a lyricist?
Not so much. I'm more an instrumental composer, but I do work with lyricists. I have, like you alluded to earlier in the intro, I produced many records for and with other artists, a lot of them vocalists and lyricists. And I was in the room co-writing lyrics too, but I'm not typically one to come up with the lyrics. I'm the one to come up with the music usually.
I see. So you don't rely upon lyrics to get your story across, in other words. So you obviously meditate. You obviously think that meditation opens up the door to the creative flow. And you obviously know there's a connection between music, vibration, energy, and consciousness. So with your experience as a musician, how do you define consciousness?
That's a good one.
It's a crazy question, isn't it? Because it's so ubiquitous.
I don't think I can have an answer that I could put into words just because of everything I mentioned just now. I think words fall short to even describe it. But I will say that consciousness can be, because we just talked about truth. I think there's some correlation here between truth and consciousness. And what I mean by that is that our truth subjectively is always limited because we are limited in our physical manifestation. I believe we're part of the bigger picture as well as being separate selves. And that can be true at the same time. So we can be the wave on the ocean and the ocean itself. And it's not a contradiction, But where I'm going with this is that by being our separate selves, we only perceive truth and reality through the slit of our perception that we have.
Yes.
However, we can expand that window, so to speak, of perception and expand consciousness. And then with that, expand what's true, because our truth is limited, because of our conditioning and all that. But we're connected to the bigger truth. And I think the more we expand our consciousness and our awareness, the more we tap into what's true. And I think paradoxical things can be true with an expanded awareness and consciousness. Let's say you're here and you're not here at the same time, which is a conundrum. And it doesn't make sense to the logical mind, but it can make sense to an expanded consciousness, because if you eradicate time and space as a constant, then future, past, and the present moment can all coexist in the same moment, and it's not a problem. It's not a contradiction, and that goes with expansion of consciousness to me. So this doesn't answer your question to what consciousness is, but it maybe points towards what it can be if it's expanded, and that's human evolution. If we evolve as a species by expanding our consciousness, then we can evolve what we perceive, and then that can basically widen the window of what's true.
Well, I have to say that you answered the question beautifully. It's a trick question because I ask all of my guests that very question. Consciousness is ubiquitous, right? Everybody experiences it. We have a bunch of different scientists exploring it from a scientific model, trying to understand the mechanisms of consciousness. There's the philosophical, there's the psychological, there's the neurological, then you get into the weird world of psi and you get into the spiritual aspects of consciousness. When I ask any of my guests the question, what is consciousness? And meanwhile, we've spent most of the show talking about how they're working with consciousness and their understandings of it. That direct question always throws people. Nobody knows what consciousness truly is. Even those of us who explore it, right? Even those of us who are aware that we are aware and we can expand it. So I love where you're going with the expansion. Personally, I think that was one of the best answers I've ever heard. But I'm a musician, so I share your viewpoint. But I've spoken with, physicists. I've spoken with psi researchers. I've spoken with neurologists and psychologists. And that question is just, too big. And
it's too big. It's big for one person. And it's maybe speaks to the fact that the human collective can only answer this question, because what I just spoke about the limited perspective that we all have. If you think about modular synthesis, without being too nerdy, where you plug in different oscillators through different things,
right?
You're connecting things, you let things flow through other modules, etc. And then what comes out is a different experience sonically. And I think the same is true in the exploration of consciousness. We all need to not just compare notes from different perspectives, but literally bring it together. That's where neuroscience and quantum physics and spirituality, they need to all interface, because they're all unique perspectives on the same truth, but they're all, limited in their perspective, So I think the truth lies in the combination of all these, and maybe eventually we will piece it together as a puzzle that it is, to all of us.
In the current vernacular, boom. That is exactly why we're having this conversation now. That is exactly why this podcast exists, and why we interview so many different people from so many different perspectives. Because our belief is that here, myself, the producers, the Monroe Institute, is that if we can have this conversation openly, talk about it, respectfully, listen, respectfully, share ideas, maybe, just maybe, somewhere, we'll find that golden nugget between the acoustic and the synthesis and that beautiful sound that nobody's ever heard before. And we can all start moving in a totally different direction. Your ideas and inspiration are obviously informed by your experience. They're informed by the way that things vibrate through you, the way they sound to you, the way they move you. We know that your means of composition is a kind of blend in and of itself, right? It's not, you're not a trained composer, or you're not like Beethoven, where you start to say, okay, I'm going to work in this mode and I'm going to work in this time signature. And then, so theory and composition are not your thing. You go into the flow, you're finding the balance between that tension of opposites. I heard you holding that. You realize that is something that you feel within yourself, and it has to do with a subconscious reflection, right? It's also part of a super conscious idea and construct when you can connect with something else. Let's talk about your experience of that, the transcendent nature of music, because as I listen to your music and have produced this type of music before, and this is the type of work that I do as a recording engineer, I know that the listener ultimately wants to get to a point of transcendence. It's always fascinating to me when an ego wants to transcend itself. That speaks to me. That tells me that the ego doesn't know something that it wants to know. What is beyond itself? It's reaching higher.
Exactly.
Right. It's reaching higher. It's on one level afraid to look into the blackness. On another level, it wants to know what's in the blackness. It wants to know what's in the void, because it senses something is true there. You take people on these journeys. You've mentioned all of these principles. That's obviously the intention behind your music. Let's talk about the way you do that vibrationally. How do you achieve that as a composer? I know it's on an intuitive level.
Yeah.
What goes through your mind as you're finding the right tone and timbres and melody or lack of melody, the tempo and the structure of the music that you're using? What is it you're trying to achieve? And
it's a tough question for me, honestly, because my work is so intuitive that I find it difficult to describe the process as something very conscious. It is conscious, of course. I'm not in a dream state, or I'm very present. I meditate before I work. Usually, I have like a routine around that. Also, removing a lot of clutter and unneeded energies that I might bring into the studio or wherever I might end up working. So I try to be as clear of a channel, so to speak, as possible. But of course, the ego is always present, and you spoke to the ego, and I think that's a very important point that you made about the ego being afraid to go into the dark cave, but also sensing that there is something in there that it needs to even evolve beyond itself, And that's the conundrum of the ego, because does it really want to evolve beyond itself? The ego is usually the one that likes everything the way it is. It's the one that, subscribes to a very clear narrative of who I am and who I'm not.
Right.
It's very separate from everything around it. I am this, you are that.
Right.
Clearly not that. I'm very much this. So transcending that would mean that the ego would be open to the idea that it's not only this, but also that. And that could be seen as the death of ego. And that's why it's afraid to go into the dark cave, because it would lose it,
Right.
Ultimately, I think that's the aspiration that drives humanity on a lower frequency level, if we speak in terms of a frequency band, and a lower frequency expression would be greed. Greed comes from the ego thinking it doesn't have enough, so it needs to grasp, it needs to defend itself against others. A frequency level up, the same thing would be aspiration, which is the same dynamic drive as greed in terms of evolutionary drive.
Right.
But it's not about yourself only, exclusively. It's about aspiring to something higher than yourself. And that can include others. This is where it becomes a dialogue between you and the world, and you know what I mean? And then a frequency band above that could be ascension, and that includes literally everyone. You don't ascend alone, because, there isn't any you that can ascend. There's only the collective that can ascend if you reach that understanding that there is no separation. So I think it's really that. It's like the ego on the low vibrational frequency buys into the illusion of separation and stays into that defensive mode. And the further it reaches out into the cave, the more it realizes it's not only this, but it's also that. And eventually it transcends all of this by being part of what it was always part of in the first place, So it's like a homecoming. You spoke of Joseph Campbell,
Yes.
So eventually coming home to yourself, and that realization. So I don't know if this answered your question about.
It did. It answered my question beautifully.
Okay, good.
No, it really did, because you alluded to it earlier in the conversation. You're holding that tension of opposites, but you want to create music that's aesthetically pleasing and inviting, and then you lead them to this void.
That's right. And, there's something else I say sometimes. I would like to trick people into healing themselves. What I mean by that is that they don't have to understand the concept of what brain entrainment is or what binaural beats are and how all this works. If they find the music appealing and pleasing enough, that they want to listen to it, who cares if there's Monroe sound signals beyond them? I mean, that's great, because that's what's going to entrain their brain in the way that's going to be beneficial to their, emotional and mental well-being. But that's not the reason why they come there. They come there because they like the sound blanket that they can, lie down in and feel comfortable in, and that's what I want to achieve. I want to achieve situations, sonic environments for people to relax into and then be healed without knowing that they're being healed,
And that is a very high aspiration and the mark of an artist who I believe work will age very well, because such works of art have done exactly that. They've inspired us to continue to reach higher, to look more deeply within ourselves. So for those who are listening to this interview and want to know more about you and your work, your web address is
robotsdon'tsleep.com.
robotsdon'tsleep.com. Hence the reason my little joke in the beginning of the interview. I think you do amazing work, and I love what you're trying to do to bring people into a healing state without them really knowing that that's what they're targeting. I love your viewpoints of the ego and where it's going. I love how you express your own longings and the longings of a greater portion of humanity. This is a quest, as Joseph Campbell, one of my true mentors in life, had noticed. This is what we're doing. We're all on a hero's journey, and we're all in it together, and we are experiencing this subject-object split, and we are playing as if it is separate. We're separate from each other, separate from the earth, separate even from the divine, and that eventually we will ascend, and I'm giving quote unquote for the audience who cannot see me, in some form that will most probably be a unified form of consciousness. My hope is that we will not rely upon artificial intelligence, which is nothing more than a reflection of human consciousness and concept, techniques or technology applied, but we'll reach higher through this thing that we're calling consciousness itself, that we will reach through dialogue, through collapsing those dualities of the subject-object split, through collapsing those dualities of divinity and humanity. And I believe, personally, all of that is available through this thing that we call vibration, through the exploration of vibration. What are your thoughts about that? Closing thoughts.
I could not agree more. I think you put it beautifully. And I don't feel like I have anything to add to that, really, because I would just throw other words around it that would basically just repeat the same thing again. And I just want to leave your statement sort of untouched by not adding anything to it.
Well, as we both know, there's truth there. We can express it. We both recognize it. We feel it in our bodies. But simultaneously, as we explored before, the minute you put that label on it with a word, it's gone. There's something more. And I think that is intentional on some weird level. It's almost as if truth, like evolution, reveals itself. And then once we realize it, we have a cognizant understanding of it and can articulate it or contain it within a word, truth, or a series of words. Truth itself says, oh, good for you. You managed to figure out that much. Well, here, let's move the line a little bit further so you keep on reaching.
Right, exactly. That's the process. It's evolution, evolution of consciousness.
That's right. And that's what we're here to do, help evolve consciousness. But you and I can't do this. We can only join in this. We can only join in this conversation. The folks who are listening can only join in if we all at least become curious about what's in that darkness, equaling the quote-unquote unknown. Let's make it more friendly.
Yeah.
It's not so dark. It's not so terrible. It's not evil. It's not going to gobble you up. It's just what you don't know. If you can handle your threshold for the unknown and be willing to explore it with curiosity through whatever forms of or method that you use, whether it be meditation or a form of spirituality that's, established, it doesn't matter. Don't land. Don't land. Don't rest on your laurels. Keep reaching higher.
That's exactly right. Also the comfort zone that we all individually experience is that what we need to get beyond, because that's, again, the ego likes to have the confines of what we know and what we believe to be true. Mm-hmm. And that's our comfort zone, because that's the horizon of what we know and believe for us to work for us, and then mm-hmm. we can expand that, and we can expand the idea of what that is, who we are even,
Amen.
And I think in a collective way, it's exactly what you said. It can only be achieved collectively. Mm-hmm. That's where we need to overcome that illusion of separation, which, the ego keeps us sort of glued to. But, I also don't want to speak badly about the ego, because we need it in this physical embodiment. It has a good point, it serves us. Just like the mind is a great tool for many things. It's just like a terrible master, in that way. So we should, I think our society, if you think of left brain as yang and like right brain as yin, there needs to be that balance. And we're in a very left brain societies. Science dominates, and it's sort of like the dogma. What is not proven scientifically doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Everything else is speculation. And, I'm not against science at all. I just say, let's open up the conversation and the potential of what we can explore, and not limit ourselves by the status quo of what science is able to explain today.
I, too, love science. I really do. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, over the past few years, I have lost a bit of my faith in science to do what it needs to do in order to serve us. That could be a very long... It can't do it alone. No, it can't do it alone. And we're also finding that scientism, in this conversation that we're having with all these people here, scientism is the belief of a righteousness in the dogma of science, mm-hmm. as it's established now. That is not science. You may as well just call that religion. Yeah. Nothing wrong with the tradition, nothing wrong with religions, in my opinion, but they stop. They concretize at a certain point. Mm-hmm. Exploring requires challenging your assertions. Exploring requires challenging other people's assertions. We can do this respectfully. We can. Mm-hmm. We just need to find a way to do it respectfully. And the only way to do that, at least in my humble opinion as an artist and recording engineer, is to be able to use ears. God, quote unquote, gave you one mouth and two ears. If we all learn to use them in proportion, maybe, just maybe, we'll get a little further than we've done thus far.
Very true.
So what's next for the robot who doesn't sleep?
That's a good question. Well, there's going to be more explorations of consciousness with the Monroe Institute. I will probably join the Creation Station, which is a program they put on, which I believe you're very familiar with. And I'm just curious what that's going to be like. And there's already a full body of work of mine, which is underscored with Monroe sound signals. Mm-hmm. That's still going to be released. So it's a consecutive 45 minutes. I believe it's 45, maybe it's less, 30-something minutes, like a full body of work, which has different sound signals underneath it. And we're going to release that. My new album, As Foam and Sand, which is actually the ambient project that was born in the pandemic when I was unable to tour. So we talked about the downsides. And,
right.
There's two sides to everything. So I was confined in my studio. I was unable to tour, but then I was gifted a new project, so to speak. And that record releases next Friday, actually. I shouldn't probably talk about times because I don't know when this podcast airs, but it comes out in March.
I'm sure that your record will be released before this podcast is. So the release date, I believe, is like March 17th or 18th or somewhere within there.
That's
if
correct.
People want to listen to it, how do they get to it?
Well, it's on all the streaming platforms, whatever your preference is, Spotify, Apple. These are, the names of these. So
right.
When you find your music, that's where you'll find that record too.
Foam and Sand is the name of the record. It comes out very soon. If you haven't listened to it by now, you're going to have to listen to it the minute that you listen to this podcast. It's really beautiful work. I think you do great work in general. I wish you every success in your mission. I want you to keep that creative flame lit, but for God's sakes, get some sleep. Find some balance. Robot Robert, thank you very much for being with me today. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you, and I'll look forward to speaking with you in the future, and I expect to hear great things from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Big pleasure.
Pleasure was mine.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.